Those are the foundations that brought us the dollar standard, right? So we are literally reversing those. So I don't see, that's why I'm a bit more skeptical of those who are saying, oh, no, the dollar's never gonna, this is all rubbish about the decline of the dollar. I don't think it's the decline of the dollar per se within America or whatever, but on the international trading circuit, I do think we're going to a multipolar world. That's not to say the yuan or the ruble or Bitcoin's going to be better than the dollar. I just think we lose that neutral clearing point altogether.
Imagine spending an hour with the world's greatest traders. Imagine learning from their experiences, their successes, and their failures. Imagine no more. Welcome to Top Traders Unplugged, the place where you can learn from the best hedge fund managers in the world so you can take your manager, due diligence, or investment career to the next level. Before we begin today's conversation, remember to keep two things in mind. All the discussion we'll have about investment performance is about the past, and past performance does not guarantee or even infer anything about future performance. Also understand that there's a significant risk of financial loss with all investment strategies, and you need to request and understand the specific risks from the investment manager about their product before you make investment decisions. Here's your host, veteran hedge fund manager Niels Larsen.
A new world order is becoming clearer by the day, and in our Global Macro series, I, along with my co-host Cem want to dig deep into the minds of some of the most prominent experts to help us try and better understand what the new global macro-driven world will look like. We want to explore their perspectives on a host of game-changing issues and hopefully dig out nuances in their work in places that others may have missed. And we want to share our journey with you. Our guest today is one of the most respected journalists in the financial media who focuses on stories being missed by the wider journalistic pack. So please enjoy our conversation with the former editor of the award-winning Financial Times Alphaville blog and now founder and editor of The Blind Spot, Izabella Kaminska. Izzy, welcome and thank you so much for joining Cem and I today for what I'm sure will be a fantastic conversation as part of our Global Macro series. How are you doing? It must be a busy time for you at the moment.
I'm doing really well. Thank you very much. And yes, it's been really busy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, right now, we're witnessing some significant shifts around the world, not just in terms of policies and events, but also how they're being reported to us. So we could not be more excited than to have you on the show because of your background within the media space, but also because of the shift that you've made recently in order to get a bit more kind of journalistic freedom, if I can phrase it like that. So let's just dive in. And since it's the first time you've been on our podcast, perhaps I could ask you just to set the stage and provide a little bit of context for our conversation by maybe sharing some of the highlights from your journey so far and what got you into journalism and your time at the Financial Times, of course, and what led you to go independent and start The Blind Spot.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's really a pleasure. My journalistic career started many moons ago in 2001. In fact, I did a journalism master's at a now defunct, well, it's not defunct, it's part of the London Institute now. It was then the London College of Printing. And then from there, I went to work at Reuters, at CNBC, at Platts. I've been sort of very much market focused in my time. I also did a bunch of independent journalism in the former Soviet republics back in the day. And then I ended up at the Financial Times in 2008 on Alphaville, which was the award-winning financial blog there. I became editor there in 2017 and I left just a few months ago, actually. And now I'm heading up The Blind Spot, which is my own independent venture, currently a one-woman job with a few freelancer helpers here and there. But I'm hoping to expand shortly. And the idea really is to leverage the ability to be independent in a way that I think is, back in the day, Alphaville was very, I would say, both creative and adventurous in its coverage, and that just through the nature of bureaucratization and professionalization, that becomes more and more difficult when as a brand gets established. So the sort of cutting edge stuff we were doing, it became a bit harder to do that stuff at the FT. As the rest of the newspaper caught up with the digital sort of phenomenon. So now, back when we were starting out, no one really was on Twitter, believe it or not. There was a blogosphere, but everything was fairly amateur. So we were able to operate quite quickly and loosely. But as the rest of the media professionalized, there were higher standards, I think, expected. I'm not saying that I want to lower the standards, but it's more that sort of community-based feeling fell away because it became a much slicker operation, so to speak. And with the blind spot, I want to get back to that sort of early days feel where it's community-led. And I'm very interested in expanding in what I would call sort of financial OSINT or open source intelligence as well, which I think you have to really do in an independent way. It's harder to do that at a major corporation. So that's the short and tall of it, the long and tall of it, whatever you want to say. Yes, that's about it.
Absolutely. That's just fantastic. Jim, why don't you kick it off today with some of your thoughts and topics you want to dive into?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining us, Izabella. Big fan of your work. Really refreshing to hear, your independent view. Have been a follower of your blog for a while. You capture a lot of stories that are being missed kind of by the wider journalistic kind of pack, if you will. I'd love to start at 30,000 feet and kind of talk big picture before we kind of zoom in. A recent blog post you wrote about mentioned kind of this view of, history as old as time, if you will, of anacyclosis, right? And that democracy is potentially at this point where it's descending into, mob rule, right? I'd love to hear your thoughts about kind of the history, what the Fed's role has been in this, and where do you see us kind of in the West, autocracy versus democracy right now?
So, I'm so glad you picked up on my anacyclosis craze. I've been a fan of the theory for many, many years. I did ancient history at UCL as my undergraduate, and that's where I really first came across the theory. I just thought it was fabulously elegant in many ways, and the cyclicality of it, for those who don't know, the basic idea is that power corrupts and all forms of government are susceptible to these corruption forces, and whether it's a monarchy, an oligarchy, or even a democracy, over time, the forces of corruption turn a good example of, say, all of the three into a bad one. It's the archetype you see in Star Wars or Game of Thrones. So that's the that's the neat summary of the theory. Where we are now, I think there is I was commenting today in a piece I just put out in my wrap that I think there's a real schism in the kind of commentariat space in general with respect to whether we are, as a civilization, as sort of Western civilization, teetering on the brink of collapse. I think there are those who definitely think that there are forces of malaise and I guess risk coming in such ways that the stability we've been so used to is under threat. And then there are those, I think, who when people discuss this are sort of saying, well, the problem isn't democracy, the problem is all these other things, blah, blah, blah. Whereas I do sense that is one of the problems, is that just proposing the idea that democracy itself might be under threat because of the system itself having become maybe corrupted is a controversial point in and of itself. And it's all very well sort of saying, well, we live in a democracy, blah, 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 but that doesn't really cut it in from my perspective, because the checks and balances that have been put into the system aren't enough anymore to prevent certain sort of powers dominating in ways that are undermining specifically the middle classes, I would say. And historically, it's only a thriving middle class that allows for a good form of democracy. So once you remove that sort of thriving middle class from the equation, it's very hard to retrace a healthy democracy. And are we teetering back towards government influence over central banks? I think possibly yes. That's really the question on my mind, I think, with central banks, is how independent are they these days?
Yeah, I find it very interesting. I've actually pulled on a few of these threads myself, and I couldn't agree with you more that, the Federal Reserve ultimately has made it easy for government, right? They've been solving a lot of problems along the way, which has relieved the pressure on government to build to a much bigger level. And I think government is now, with COVID and several other pressures, really taking the mantle. I'm a volatility manager actually by training, and we think a lot about and talk a lot about the mathematical kind of distributions of events, right? I've talked a lot about leptokurtic distributions lately, and what that is fat tails. Essentially, my analogy I like to think about, and I'd like to hear your thoughts, is there is a building potential energy within a constrained system that's been happening for a while, right? But that doesn't mean the leverage or the risks haven't been building, right? The question is, when do the constraints, which have been, in my view, the Fed and liquidity broadly, when they get removed, that potential energy has been there all along, but people haven't really been thinking about it. And I think you talk a lot about that in some of your blogs, about how people in finance in particular have been thinking everything's normal. There's nothing that's changed in this world, but certain forces have been building for a while. And the world is still a dangerous world out there. The energy is actually bigger than ever. Love to hear your thoughts.
I would agree with that. And I think there is still this battle between those who perceive risk as fundamentally reducible and those who see it as transferable only, right? I think those are the two clashes in the market in terms of how to deal with these things. And I believe definitely the risk situation is, from my perspective, one where we're only transferring these pressures, and over time people belatedly realize this, but they're always caught out because of this sort of, when you're in the groupthink, you don't realize you're in the groupthink. And being one of the problems is the groupthink, which emerges from the solutions that we create solutions, aka for example, the 2008 crisis came along. We created all these regulations. We supposedly stabilized the system, made it stronger, and now we're sitting there in a sort of, we're fairly complacent about that. But have we inadvertently transferred that risk elsewhere and into different forms? We won't know, because until the bubble bursts within those new risk zones, it will be hard to, people in the bubble don't realize that they are taking undue risk. That's the whole point of the bubble, right? If you know what it is, it's not going to be a bubble. So that's one of the, that's why with the blind spot, I'm always trying to look beyond what the consensus is saying, and that makes me a natural contrarian. But I do think that's the only way you can hedge against some of these unexpected sort of future fallouts, is you really have to stress test not just the conventional risks, but the new risks coming from all sorts of different areas. And my hunch right now is that this is, we're stepping into a schismatic world where it's going to be multipolar from now on, and there is a perception, I think, that we, the West, can maintain our supremacy within that world, or at least maintain a healthy kind of financial structure. And I'm not sure that is a wise perspective, because I think the era of the kind of so much of the wealth that we've produced, in the last 30 years or so, like the whole period of globalization, like intensive globalization, I don't think we can simply go to a multipolar world and not suffer a regression, which will impact the stability of the financial system itself. That's my hunch. Whether it plays out that way, I guess we will only see.
I want to try and go in a slightly different direction. As I mentioned, there are so many directions we can go with you, and I'd like to try and I get this feeling that your sources and the things you're going to be writing about on The Blind Spot is, of course, different to what the mainstream media has been reporting. So I would like, because I think for me at least, a lot of the challenges that we see play out now, although they've been building up for a while, for me, they became very clear during COVID. COVID for me is something that is kind of a starting point in some ways of kind of stripping out some of the bubble-like that we are seeing now. And I would like to try and go back and ask you now that we have kind of have COVID behind us to some extent, we're not so emotionally involved in it. I would like to hear your kind of analysis of where we are in that and what it's meant. And we can go from, biosecurity, biowarfare, we can go to Wuhan, we can go to Bobby Malone and censorship. I would like to actually also hear whether you've come across Robert Kennedy's latest book. There are so many things I'd love to dig into, so feel free to start where you want and give us your analysis of the situation.
Yeah, I do think, for me, COVID was definitely a turning point in terms of how I see the world. I've been on a journey myself, and I go through periods of optimism and periods of pessimism. I tend to be pessimistic when everyone else is optimistic and vice versa. And with COVID, my personal journey was that I was incredibly fearful in January and February when the original news was coming out. This is, typical me, is that everyone else was dismissing it at that point, and I was like, no, this is huge. This is going to be a really big thing. And I was the overreacting one. I was buying all the masks and, all the goggles. I was preparing for a nightmare. But then as the kind of system picked up with my mentality, I talked myself off that cliff, right? And I started to realize that so much of my fear was based on social media. And I'm not saying there's nothing to be fearful of. I had COVID myself. I think it's a serious disease. It's obviously, a major issue. Don't get me wrong. But I do think what made me sort of second guess myself was the way we just collectively decided to take the lockdown policy and not really review it or analyze it. And that challenging or questioning it became taboo almost overnight. And I found that very hard to digest. And I especially found it difficult to understand where my colleagues were coming from, because as journalists, I thought it was our job to question things. And the kind of near universal compliance with the policy completely confounded me. And as the natural contrarian, I just felt I had to continuously question this. And I always thought that we would be kicking the can down the road. And I think to some degree, that view has been vindicated when you look at Australia and you look at sort of the zero COVID nations, and you see that they haven't really withstood, the impact. And obviously now you see Shanghai, you see what's going on in China, and you realize that this lockdown policy wasn't necessarily, it was always in my mind completely mad. It seemed inevitable that we would have to face the consequences of the virus itself. Now, that's not to say we weren't to do anything. And I guess I am open to the idea that we bought some time in terms of developing treatments and in terms of doing, better protocols and all that. So I can just about get on board the idea of the first lockdown, but I still favored the Swedish approach. And I didn't like the sort of the kind of nanny state mentality that completely eliminated personal choice from the equation. I like to think of the citizenry as being able to decide, what they can handle in terms of risk themselves. And I think the scandals that we're now seeing with everything from Boris Johnson's Partygate to, there was so much hypocrisy amongst the people setting these laws, which just shows that the rules themselves were really not, they were impossible to follow. So much of it was theatre. And what the other thing that grates me now is that in terms of like figures, in terms of death figures, at least, perhaps not in terms of the compared to the early kind of 2020 period, but certainly compared to the other intensive lockdown periods we've had, the new waves are still going. COVID is still a thing, but somehow we've just completely switched into this mentality that it doesn't matter. And that to me proves how much of a media phenomenon and how much of a kind of collective fear brainwashing situation, it was. The fact that you can just, I mean, obviously there is still the fearful out there, but like by and large, society's just decided to move on now and it doesn't care. I find that quite fascinating. And it just proves to me that sort of groupthink, that is exactly the same sort of thing you see in financial markets. It's the same groupthink phenomenon. That's what's dangerous, I think. And we have not been swept up in that sort of massive way, really, since Second World War. The last time that many people were encouraged to do something that was ultimately self-sabotaging, in my opinion, was, the Germans during the Second World War. And that might seem quite an extreme thing to say, but I think it was similar forces, these forces of you think you're doing something that is in your tribe considered to be the right thing, and you don't question it because it's so part of the peer, the conformed view is that this is the right thing to do. I mean, that's quite a lot of rambling from me.
I mean, sure, and there are some specifics that I'd like to dive into a little bit. But just when you say this thing about being asked to do something that you're kind of being just told to do, I mean, frankly, it seems like that's a little bit what's happening with these frankly poor Russian soldiers who are being sent to an exercise, a training exercise, not knowing they're going to war. I mean, we can think of the war what we want, and I think we all fall on the side of the Ukraine, but we have to distinguish between the regime, the Putin regime, and the Russian people, because they're not the same thing, in my opinion. But there are some crossovers, I think, and I don't know if you have. I don't know. I have this feeling that you have some great intelligence and sources that we don't know of, so to speak. But there are some overlaps because, for example, things like the COVID and the biolabs. Right now, we're hearing at least Russia saying, well, actually, the US were having biolabs in Ukraine. That's one of the reasons why they went in. We have Hunter Biden's laptop, which is being exposed, where there seems to be kind of evidence of that. What are you hearing on topics like that, and how do you think it plays into all of this?
Well, I think there are a lot of parallels in that it's again, it's this sort of collective mentality that is a group like some sort of group formation where we can't really question what the consensus is, because if you do so, you're seen as some sort of traitor or saboteur, and you're gonna undermine your tribe, so to speak. So that's the obvious parallel. In terms of like the biolabs, I find it fascinating how what seem to me quite logical questions are seen as taboo, and how the media complex constrains any questioning that challenges the sort of established narrative. And I've kind of come up with a theory about that, which I would call the kind of media segmentation theory. But before I explain that, I'll just say that the same exact thing kind of happened with the lab leak theory with Wuhan, which was that any questioning that it might not be natural origin was like, it just wasn't allowed. Like nobody even raised it. When I brought it up internally at the FT, I was one of few people pushing for it. And I felt, I don't know, because I wasn't privy to all the conversations, right? But I felt very much that when I had those conversations with senior editors, I got the impression no one else was pushing for it because of this fear that they might be deemed a conspiracy theorist. And I wasn't, I'm very confused these days as to what is the difference between a journalist and a conspiracy theorist, because, my job as a journalist is to question things and to question and find evidence. Obviously, it's not to just make random, connections without any evidence. That's not what we're doing. But I don't think that's what we were doing with the lab leak theory. We were, as I explained to the editors, I felt there was a really important investigation to be done, whether it was to debunk the idea about it was a lab leak or whether it was to confirm or to keep the idea open. It didn't really matter. The point was that there was enough evidence or enough circumstantial evidence to merit an investigation, and yet everybody was shying away from it. And what's really interesting about these sort of groupthink phenomena is that once the tide turns, once the Overton window expands and allows for this taboo topic to be talked about, well, then it's all in and everybody goes for it and it's fine. And we almost forget that it was taboo to talk about it just 6 months ago. Yeah. And the other point was, why is this happening? And my theory is that the social media landscape has changed the way we communicate controversial, or not controversial, but sensitive information these days. The old media model, we had a free press in the West, of course, but it was always segmented, which meant that the news targeted different sort of demographics, and it packaged the news in very different ways. And it would, the tabloid press would, if it was to break controversial stories, it would still, put them in a way that was understandable, and people would go on the journey relative to their demographic sort of cliche, right? And this is why the, financial press got a reputation for being the truly kind of truth speaking one, because the financial press was seen as ambivalent to the politics of everything, because business people just want to make money, right? And so business people can't afford to be biased. They have to be dispassionate about all these things. They just need to go where the money is going to be made. And this allowed for the financial press to sort of be very matter of fact about things that, say, the more popular press might not be able to get away with saying without causing a massive hoo-ha or a some sort of storm. But with the internet and with social media especially, that segmentation has broken down, and so even the financial press has to think about the possibility that their true, I'm not saying they're not writing what they consider to be the truth, but they have to think about how it might be received by the lowest common denominator. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean it in the sense of the least informed demographic that doesn't necessarily follow the topic in hand. And that could be, the lowest common, for me, if there's some news about, I don't know, pop music, blah blah blah, I'm the lowest common denominator in that, so because I wouldn't know what's going on in the world of music. So what I'm just trying to neutralize what I'm saying there is that in terms of the knowledge base of the recipient, right? And as a result, everyone has to kind of walk around on eggshells and create content that has to be very, very careful in case it's taken the wrong way by people who don't have the backstory. And that dumbs down the entire cross-section of news because everyone's on the internet. So then, and this sort of maybe is a bit self-promotional, but I think the only way around that is to then regate things. And you see that with Twitter and all the social media, the censorious nature of it, I think is a kind of, it's these forces of segmentation trying to get back in there and sort of say, well, some things are too, it's that old cliche of Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men, you can't handle the truth, right? So we're going to have to compartmentalize it. And Twitter is too broad a public forum to really allow for any kind of unconstrained discussion. But, if you are prepared to pay and, prove that you're a informed person in this particular field, that, you know, in behind the little gates that we're now creating all these independent, you know, bloggers and independent media, they can, because they're speaking to their own audience again, it's the return of segmentation that allows for truth speaking. So I think the future of media is going to be, it's sort of this eternal cycle of like consolidation, fragmentation, and we're now fragmenting to resegment, to bring these segments back into the media so that we can tell the truth, but in a controlled way, because the broader population can't handle it, so to speak. That's the perception, I think.
Yeah, and I agree to a lot of that, but I do think that, unfortunately, I think that I'm not so sure that media will ever be the same after COVID, frankly, and also because there's so many other things that we learned during COVID, such as how to control a crowd, as you rightly said, and China obviously is doing that very effectively right now, using mostly, I think, technology that's developed in the Western world. We saw even very close to home some pretty extraordinary measures, like in Austria with their COVID policies. We've seen now things happening in Canada in the last few months, which is, again, something that I don't think we would have seen 5 years ago, but now we have these extreme measures. So democracy is changing, and I fear a little bit for the children that we have put into the world, that is more going to be like the rules they're going to live under than the rules we grew up under. And it, just before you jumping in, Cem, here, and it leads me to a question which I haven't thought about much myself, so I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. We often talk about these kind of shifts in economics, cycles, and obviously we talk about demographics as well, but shifting culture. For me, this is a shift in culture, if I can put it like that. And I wonder what a shift in culture like this actually does to economics, if I can put it like that. Have you ever thought about what the economic impact of a shift in culture like this can have?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean, economics, I would say, is 90% of the stuff in economics everyone agrees on. And then there's 10%, which is highly politicized and nobody agrees on, right? So it's that 10% margin that like makes all the economists on Twitter hate each other, right? All the different schools. What I think, with the culture wars, as they end up kind of being applied to the field of economics, that 10% is going to become increasingly polarized. And I think you see that already, to the point where what were perceived as legitimate schools like neoliberalism or laissez-faire concepts are going to be seen as extreme, like almost, I mean, it's already taboo to say you are an Austrian economist, right? And I think that is not a good place for debate, for academia. I mean, whatever you think of I am the sort of person who thinks there's a little bit of truth and a little bit of wrong in absolutely all theories. Yeah, I like to analyze all of them. I always learn from all sorts of theories. I don't like to just completely close my eyes to an entire field. That doesn't mean I'm not going to critique it. But where that leaves us is in the sort of economics of just like with journalism, you ended up with one-sided journalism, you're going to end up with one-sided economics. Well, we've been in that situation before. The USSR is a very good example of one-sided economics. And my mother, for example, she's now passed, so she won't mind me telling you this. She did an economics degree at the school of SGH, which is the Warsaw School of Economics, basically. Very illustrious university these days, and the equivalent of like the Polish LSE, so to speak. But she, even though she had a master's in economics, when she came to the UK in the 70s, she did not use that on any of her credentials when she was looking for a job, because she was embarrassed, because she thought people in the UK are just going to think I have a joke degree, because the economics I'm learning is a one-sided economics. It's Marxist based. It doesn't accept free markets. It doesn't accept any of the conventional doctrine. And she would, she basically said, this is not a real economics degree, like whatever. But what she found fascinating many years later is that all her fellow kind of economists from that year, they had no trouble using those credentials in the international sort of market, right? So you had this situation where people who'd been taught communist style economics ended up being accepted in the sort of international economic community as if they had learned like the broad brush economic space. And many of them will have probably adjusted and adapted and self-learned, evolved their thinking. But a lot of the older guys won't have done so. And there's these massive knowledge gaps that appear, mainly because by the time you're in your 50s, you're not going to admit that you didn't learn the basics of, DSGE or whatever, because it wasn't like part of the syllabus in the, in that system. So that's what I worry, is that we will end up in this one-sided economics educational environment, which will make it not just taboo to think about free markets or like unconstrained. I'm not saying I advocate unconstrained sort of neoliberalism, free markets, whatever. But I'm just saying I'm worried that that's totally off the table. And I don't think anything should ever be off the table, because then that will impact the real world. And of course, where did the thinking in communist Poland end up, or USSR? Ended up in a system that frankly self-imploded because of the economic misallocation, right? So that's the risk, I think.
Yeah, to go down that path a little bit more, I don't think we can talk about economics without talking about the Fed a bit more. We've had one-sided economics essentially for 40 years, which is supply-side monetary policy-driven economics. So it's been free market economics on steroids. It's created a technological revolution, right? It's created infinite supply for capital, and that's actually been a great thing for supply, but created a slightly deflationary environment, which led to more of the same. That now I think has led to a lot of inequality, right? Over that 40-year period. I think that's pretty well established at this point. The question is that opening the door for more governmental, the other side now being overly dominant? Is the pendulum now going to swing too far the other way? I mean, I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts on where we are in terms of regime change, the Fed, monetary policy, et cetera.
Well, I think that's exactly it. I think we went too far one way, and then now we are sort of overcorrecting and going too far the other way. And but I'm also concerned that, because in a perfect world, you get those undulations, and one keeps the other honest. Like, that's the whole beauty of like having an open debate situation or a free system where you can regulate again. So actually a good comparison is, shadow government, like a shadow here in the UK. Obviously we have the cabinet, but we also have the shadow cabinet, right? Because that's how we keep the core government accountable, and there's a sort of alternative that's pushing back against it and offering different ideas. We also had it with COVID. We had SAGE, which was like the policy making division in the government, the advisors, but we also had shadow SAGE, which actually ended up being even more extreme. But that's the idea, being that it's good to have this sort of undulation between one and the other, and a devil's advocate for the defense as well as for the prosecution. So I think that's where we're going. The problem is that the undulation is swinging more and more erratically and more extremely. So whereas we used to be sort of just, if you think of it visually, like, undulating about a centimeter from one to the other, we're now like in the meters, so we're going from one extreme to the other extreme. And I worry that now, especially, we will have this kind of period where government will become increasingly influential over money markets. I've dubbed it, specifically with reference to the US. I've dubbed it sort of the end of the neutral dollar period. And of course, that's a misnomer in some ways, because it's not like the US was never, the dollar has always been political to some degree. Like, it represents free markets, a free system, that's political, right? Don't get me wrong. But those, and certainly the US government has always been a political beast, even in the 80s and 90s, whatever, and in the standoff with the USSR and in the Cold War. But what I mean about the neutrality of the dollar is that there was a separate sort of ecosystem for the dollar as a medium of exchange, which was fairly neutral and totally depoliticized. And that was in the euro dollar market and the offshore dollar, where really the dollar could be transacted, by anyone. It was whether they were your like enemy of America, or, friendly country to America or unfriendly country. It didn't really matter. In fact, to the contrary, we were quite happy if, say, the USSR started using the dollar as its second currency, because we saw it as a sort of mechanism to infiltrate a closed system with an open mechanism, right? So the dollar would then undermine all those capital controls and open the system up. And it did in many ways, because absolutely every single corrupt official in the USSR had a dollar account in Switzerland, right? So that made them have an interest in opening themselves to the Western system, right? So now we're doing the exact opposite, which is that we don't want the dollar to be touched by anybody, even our enemies, and we're going to do our best to kind of completely withhold access to it, to the degree that in some ways it's now like, it's with respect to the Russia-Ukraine crisis, it's Russia that is moving ahead with creating a more free and transferable medium of exchange, which is the ruble, because by simply saying you have to hold rubles to be able to buy our oil, that opens up the capital account, because it's saying, we want to sell you, stuff for rubles, right? So this is quite contrary to, I find it a weird shift in positions by the US and Russia. And I think that's indicative of the fact that we have learned that there's more to a functional system than just a free market, right? We have to have principles and a level playing field. And I actually do agree with that. But I'm concerned that that level playing field and those principles are going to be pushed upon the system from the top down, as opposed to I think a better mechanism is from the bottom up, an organic system which is community led, where we create principled interactions based on common sort of community values, right? I think that would be preferable, because as soon as you get the government telling you what your principles are supposed to be, that's not going to work. And that's when you start to emulate actually the old systems of the USSR more so than actually anything resembling a kind of flourishing free market system that is based on trust and, a level playing field.
Yeah, it's this great irony of having to protect liberal democracy by force, right? And those two tensions are very.
I've termed it like it's like a liberalism for liberalism. It's kind of crazy.
Do you think that the seizure of dollar assets, et cetera, all the economic warfare that we're amidst right now, do you think it in any way leads to? I mean, this is the $100 trillion question. Leads to a decay in the exorbitant privilege of the dollar?
Yeah, I certainly do. I think it's unfortunately a much underappreciated point in policy circles. Actually, I think there's no doubt that if you want to be the sort of go-to standard, reserve standard for the world, you have to be neutral. You have to turn your eyes, turn your head away from like bad practice, because otherwise you won't be able to be the kind of the currency of commerce, because commerce by itself, I studied ancient history, so I look at a lot of things through an ancient historical perspective, and at the end of the day, what is a trader, an international kind of privateer, or anyone involved in international commerce? It's somebody who is just looking at the business side of the equation. They just want to look at two different systems with totally different political ideologies, like whether it's the Spartans and the Athenians, or whoever, and they might not agree politically, but they have each of these different zones have their advantages and their disadvantages. The Athenians will need X and have too much of Y. And a trader, a person of commerce, can interact only, they can become an intermediary, a common intermediary, only if they don't care about the politics of either side. They're just purely pragmatic, and they can see an opportunity to make some money. But they need a neutral currency of exchange to be able to talk to all the other people interacting in that sort of commercial space. It's the language of, it comes from, I mean, I hate to say it, but it comes from like the era of pirates and privateers and sort of unshackled, enterprise, right? That's what people needed. And in those days, it was gold. It was usually some form of precious metal that was seen as totally apolitical. And that's why there was a preference for it. And that's not to say fiat currency was never used, but that wasn't the normal common denominator between all the different zones. The dollar became that that common denominator because precisely there was this amnesty, or so to speak, a sort of diplomatic immunity to who held the dollars. We didn't care. We would respect it. That's gone now, I think. I think it's not just gone not so much because of Russia, actually. I think the Afghanistan precedent was much bigger because that was a direct confiscation, essentially. There is going to be some due process in terms of reallocating the Taliban money, but it's already set a precedent unlike any before, where you have a central bank that is it can't trust that its foreign exchange deposits are going to be there when they need them. So yeah, I think that is quite significant.
It's quite interesting when you sit there and you describe, what is needed, and this kind of forum of neutrality and kind of the what could a global quote unquote currency be. It reminds me of when I was listening to a panel that your friend Pippa Malmgren attended a few weeks ago at the government summit in Dubai, and she was sitting next to, or she was at a panel with, I think the Saudi oil minister, and what you described in terms of not getting involved in these kind of politics was exactly how he described OPEC. As soon as they walk into that room, even if Russia is part of it, it doesn't enter the Ukraine situation does not enter into their discussion, and even Iran and Iraq and Saudi, they are enemies. They throw drones at each other, but they're still, when they go into that OPEC meeting, that's not part of the conversation. Very interesting to make those parallels, actually.
Yeah, you need a neutral common ground. Like, that is the first rule of diplomacy, right? You need to be, a diplomat is supposed to, have this common respect for all the other diplomats. I mean, that's the first rule of diplomacy. If we lose that, and I fear we will, that is going to be problematic. And I think even in the Cold War, there were trade channels that were open. It's not like all trade was completely killed off between the USSR and America and the West. And I think there was always a practical underbelly to it, but it wasn't. That's a good example of the sort of thing that couldn't really happen these days because of the internet. If there was a bit of like discrete, state to state trade because of essential goods that are needed, an essential swap of goods, right? That is to the benefit of both countries. That would leak into the popular press and become too controversial. Therefore, I suspect that even those sort of that sort of realpolitik becomes much harder to enforce in the current situation.
Sure, and you could, of course, argue that in around 1973, 74, perhaps encouraged by Kissinger, that oil became the de facto backing or how to back the US dollar rather than gold, which obviously it had stopped being a couple of years earlier. I just want to throw in one thing, because we were talking a little bit about the Russian-Ukrainian situation, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on this. At least in the media, it's often presented as, Russia having, a very weak economic or economy as a result of all the sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of how I feel that it's being positioned. On the other hand, if you think about and in terms of the West having all the leverage. But if I'm thinking about all the things that the Western world has decided to do in kind of a U-turn in terms of policies in the last 6-7 weeks, and what it means in terms of costs for the Western world, in terms of further emergency packages on top of all the COVID stuff we did, it does seem to me like, and also the rising interest rates and rising inflation, it does seem to me that the West could actually be in not as advantageous situation as you would think. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that kind of quote unquote power balance in terms of Western economics and the Russian economy right now, given what you're seeing and hearing from your sources.
Oh, I completely agree, and I think it's really undemocratic what we're doing, actually, because I don't think we're consulting our own population on what will be quite horrific consequences if we go through with this policy. During the oil embargo in the 1970s, Nixon actually was hoping to get the American population on side. There's this incredible video of him sort of speaking to the American people and saying, because of X, Y, or Z, we're going to have to really sacrifice. We're going to have no driving on Sundays, and we might face shortages and this and that. And there was this quiet hope that the American population would get on side, right? But in the end, that didn't last very long, and America effectively capitulated, and OPEC became the established norm, and this massive transfer of power and wealth happened in terms of Saudi Arabia specifically. We transferred all this power to the Middle East, right? So I think in this situation, it is sort of a self-made embargo, right? So it's not at the hands of a third party. It is, obviously, if indirectly it is, but we are the ones that are pushing the embargo on ourselves, which will make it hard to enforce now. Theoretically, that will make it harder to enforce in the black markets, so to speak. And there's already news about, how lots of ships are loading Russian cargoes, but being very discreet about their identifiers. And, so there's already like a push towards that. The problem is, in this day and age of hyper transparency, how long can those sort of underhanded sort of mechanisms survive? I think it will be a bit like with COVID, where we're going to be very hysterical about any kind of breaking of the sanctions for the next year or so. Then there'll be the direct impact on our quality of life that comes with it. And then slowly we'll just pretend like when say the black marketeers or some companies decide to take a bit of a risk and trade or accept Russian cargoes, we'll start turning a blind eye to it, because we will get sort of sanction fatigue eventually. That's my very cynical take on the sanctions. I think they'll last, we'll do this big virtue signal, they'll work, then our own populations will really suffer, we'll see shortages, the electorate will not get behind it, people will start losing elections unless it could be that, when you look at sort of France, there isn't really an alternative that is digestible. So Macron gets to stay no matter what, because the alternatives are not really acceptable. So maybe the electorate won't have an option to vote its way out of sanctions. But I do think there will be a sort of reticence once the real impact, and the real impact is going to be massive, because even though Russia is obviously not as significant as any of the G7 in its GDP, the key point is that it is one of the top exporters of commodities and food and wheat products in the world, and it doesn't. The equity and the treasury markets and the bond markets like to say, oh, well, commodities are just tiny relative to the rest of the financial market. But what they neglect is that commodities are the input. They are the core sort of life. They're not the lifeblood. They're the oxygen in the lifeblood, right? So the lifeblood is all the other stuff. It's like the equities, the bonds, all the kind of financial complex, securities that we have. But commodities are the oxygen that the system needs to carry around itself to ensure the other stuff flows, right? And if you remove the oxygen, it doesn't take very long for the entire lifeblood and the entity itself to essentially die. So that's the metaphor that I'm using. But I think we have really underestimated. It's not the numerical kind of financial dollar value of the commodities that matters. It's how they interact with the rest of the financial system. They are literally at the key input. It's out of commodities that all the other stuff, in the system is made and depends on. So
Yeah,
that's my view.
Absolutely. It reminds me of a quote I heard. I don't know who came up with it, but someone I think just said that the Americans are ready to fight the Russians until the last Europeans, and we'll probably be the ones who feels the pressure first. Jim, where do you want to go now?
Is an interesting thread to pull on here. There's many that argue that one of the most important things that's happened in the last 20 years is the shale revolution in the United States and the energy independence that's happened in America. That energy independence has freed America from dependence, itself, not Europe, obviously, and not Western liberal democracy, but it's what's allowed the U.S. to step away from the world stage in many ways and become a little bit more egocentric. And so, it is also what you can argue continues to make dollar dominance kind of, I don't want to say indisputable, but from a practical standpoint, there are very few countries that have everything, right? That don't have negative demographic trends, that have the commodities, right, et cetera. And that underpins still dollar strength, never mind rule of law, et cetera. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the shift in commodities, particularly to the U.S.'s role, and also just to be polemical, if you think the practical realities of America and what underpins the dollar ultimately are strong enough to counteract the moral high ground we're giving up, in your thoughts.
Well, it's an interesting point you make. I do see what you're saying, and I do think that certainly shale and energy independence does make America a more independent and isolation-prone entity. That said, in terms of the politics, in terms of the sort of push from government circles to not interfere, but sort of influence the politics of outsider countries, I think that remains like the neocon sort of perspective on the world, that we have to sort of export democracy and freedom. I don't think that's gone away. The question is whether the world is going to be as receptive to those messages without any with an isolationist America, because you can kind of see where in an interdependent world how and why it makes sense for America to export democracy with to its trading partners, and people who are trading with America want to operate on the same standards. All of this encourages a dollar standard, right? Because that's the underpinning force for the dollar standard. It's the trade with your counterparts and your trading partners. But if you're becoming more and more isolationist, that goes away. And so I think by definition, an isolationist America undermines the dollar, even if it strengthens it in theory, because America is strong. That's not what makes the dollar standard. The dollar standard is as much a function of, you know, how happy people are to accept it for trade and exchange, which has to be a function of neutrality and the fact that, you know, even the enemies of America are going to use the dollar, right? And a function of a continuous flow of dollars from America abroad, which if it becomes isolationist and doesn't have to trade with anyone, well, that flow extinguishes itself, right? So the petrodollar, which was one of the main throughputs for like dollars into the international system, that dies, and that undermines the kind of sheer volume of dollars circulating through the offshore system, and will naturally undermine how much of a presence it has in international reserves. So I think there's a paradox in that situation. And of course, if you think about, you know, how America came to be the, you know, flag bearer of the dollar standard, whatever, it came through losing its independence. Like it came through effectively dropping its isolationist attitude and joining a war, right? It came as a product of Lend-Lease. It came as a product of showing to Europe that it was prepared to invest in Europe after the war as well and not worry about the consequences of whether it will get repaid. That was not an isolationist perspective. And those are the foundations that brought us the dollar standard, right? So we are literally reversing those. So I don't see, that's why I'm a bit more skeptical of those who are saying, oh, no, the dollar's never gonna, like, you know, this is all rubbish about the decline of the dollar. I don't think it's the decline of the dollar per se within America or whatever, but on the international trading circuit, I do think we're going to a multipolar world. That's not to say the yuan or the ruble or Bitcoin's going to be better than the dollar. I just think we lose that neutral clearing point altogether, which will add cost and to transactions and just general commerce overall, because traders, if they lack a common ground, they're going to have to add a premium for the risk of not knowing like the common cost of everything, right? So that naturally is going to impact inflation. So that's my view of it. I don't think a multipolar world is a world where inflation is kept in check. I think a multipolar world is one where there is continuous sort of bouts of shortages and imbalances in the market that feed inflation because you can't get that common valuation the way you would do. You have to continuously kind of create these big arbitrage opportunities to incentivize the traders to come in and take the risk.
Yeah. To use your analogy from your blog of the British Royal Navy underpinning kind of, you know, the strength of commerce and empire in Britain, isn't it ultimately, and you just spoke to kind of the dollar dominance coming out of World War II, isn't it really ultimately though power that and strength and, you know, creating order in a sense, that power that ultimately led to that strength in all those environments? I mean, in a way, the strength is more important during times of bifurcation, during times of instability. People are looking for kind of a bigger, sturdier ship, or who's that navy that's strongest, that's going to protect our assets and allow for things to occur. I don't know. Again, being polemical here, I guess. There are two sides to every story.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's ultimately strength matters, but and certainly the American NATO military complex is second to none at the moment, and is likely to stay that way. But that doesn't mean, I think, in an isolationist world, right? You can have the biggest army in the world, but if you're not prepared to use it, it's kind of meaningless, and that's that's what we learned from the Second World War, was that we needed to like break America's isolationist attitude to get it to act at all, right? So, and actually, it's quite a funny story with respect to how the British, the role that fake news played in that entire episode, because it was the Secret Service, the UK Secret Service, that apparently came up with a fake map of South America and like some fake plans about how Hitler was planning to invade South America that ended up pushing, or at least persuading FDR that I think it was a South America plan that ended up helping, as well as obviously Pearl Harbor. But in the end, it was a lot of skullduggery that like ended up pushing America into the war as well, for noble reasons. Don't get me wrong, but like it was, we had to work hard to do that, right? So in a power, yes, absolutely, we retain the power, but unless we're prepared to use it, and at the moment we are kind of, we're pushing aside the kind of raw power of it and focusing more on the economic warfare. But the economic warfare can only go so far, and eventually you're going to starve a system out. And I think the system, when you look at the Second World War, you look at the role that oil and acquisition of commodities played in that war. I think you've got NATO and you've got power, but do you have the commodities and the rare resources that are needed to continuously power that military? That's the bigger question. And yes, I'm sure America's self-sufficiency will help, but it doesn't have self-sufficiency on a lot of rare materials and resources that are also very necessary to maintain that dominance. One of which is sort of a lot of materials that are used in nuclear generation and in in ballistic missiles more generally. There are a lot of commodities that the Western system is lacking actually relative to Russia, and they might not, we haven't necessarily heard that much about, say, the shortages in noble gases like helium or in neon, all of which are essential in the making of, semiconductors and ballistic missiles, in rocket launching, all these other kind of exotic technologies that are needed to maintain the military industrial complex. So one hopes innovation, necessity is the mother of invention. So perhaps there is a workaround, and certainly there was nothing like a world war to incentivize innovation. Think of what came out of the Second World War. But at the moment, I'm not sure it's as clear cut as perhaps the market is assuming.
You talked about deglobalization. I know we have to sort of start winding down. We don't want to keep you all afternoon, even though we would love to do, but we'll respect your time, of course. But you talked about deglobalization. I just wanted to ask you one thing, because I'm sure this is an aspect of the financial world you've been following and writing about as well. And that is because Peter Zion, our previous guest, talked about, we actually have to kind of play the whole game we've had, or not game, but the way things has evolved in the last 30, 40 years, we now have to start playing that in reverse. So my question is, in a deglobalizing world, what does that impact, do you think, on things like passive investing and index funds, which have been kind of in our world, very dominant trend, so to speak, in the last 10, 15 years?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure index investing is going to suffer from deglobalization in and of itself. It really depends on, index investing is now more influenced by factors like ESG. If ESG kind of extends itself to ESGA, as I've been saying, so, adding A for ally, that limits, where investors, passive, where retail investors, all sorts of investors can put their money. It should, in theory, create a bifurcation where we've already seen it with like the Russian ETFs, etc., kind of obviously falling out of favor and suffering massive outflows relative to, that money has to go somewhere, right? So I think I don't see an immediate sort of impact other than, winners and losers based on how, obviously if you've got a ETF that is focused on global growth in some way, that's not going to do well. But say the kind of domestic, giant tech companies, whatever, that will continue to do probably quite well. So I think you just again, it's about selectivity and picking. Maybe stock picking will make a comeback because you'll have to pick the companies that are more effective at sort of reshoring or friendshoring, as Janet Yellen has called it. But the overall effect on index funds, I think it's going to just be through the price level, isn't it? It's going to be through whether the equity prices in general are going to keep up with inflation. And certainly one thing to bear in mind is that equity markets, wherever there has been like uncontrolled inflation, they're very favorable environments, because where else do you put your money? I mean, you actually don't, my view is that you don't want to buy debt securities as much as you want to buy equity, because you want to invest in real companies and essentially anything that can hedge your inflation risk. So that would be my instinct, but I haven't thought about it enough to be.
No, that's completely fair, and I do like your reference to ESG. And I would also have thought that some of the things, and I don't want to sound too political here, but just some of the things we're seeing in China right now, I do think that the G must be in trouble, simply, and yet we don't really see a lot of funds, or we still see a lot of funds actually being raised for Chinese
I think
adventures.
There's
but I've always had
one thing that might come about is that there is this fundamental clash between the E and the S and the G, right? And one of the best examples of that is sort of the solar market, where you will want to invest in solar companies because it's E, but what if those solar panels are being made by slave labor by Uyghurs, right? Then that compromises on the S and to some degree on the G as well. So which one of those is going to be more important, right? So I think the bundling of ESG together, and some might say, the A falls under G anyway, but I think that might face a reckoning. I think there might have to be a rethink in terms of what qualifies. Are we going to be more focused on the E? In which case, it shouldn't really matter whether it's an enemy state, so to speak, that's making your solar panels or whatever. At any cost, even slave labor is okay. That's the mentality. Or it's the wider bucket of things like, yes, we're worried about climate, but we'd rather maintain core values and not exploit people, blah, blah, blah. But that is a luxury, right? So it's either we are principled, or we are in a sort of save the environment at all cost kind of situation. Because the E, I think, is fundamentally, in some ways, an ends justifies the means mentality, right?
I mean, that's an astute point. I mean, to continue on that a little bit, if you look at what's happening in Europe right now with the energy crisis, many people are pointing to ESG investment over the last decade, right, as a major driver of the energy crisis that we're seeing in Europe. Many argue that it's unsustainable, and many argue that Russia's feeling of it being emboldened, and the actions that are happening now in terms of bifurcation are ultimately, and for many reasons, because of a lot of that energy policy. So speaking directly to kind of how these two things can be diametrically opposed, how much of that do you agree with, and what do you think the path forward is in terms of energy policy?
No, I totally agree with that. I think I think we have been very naive with our energy policy. I think our net zero entire the entire framing of net zero is completely naive, and the architects of that policy obviously know nothing about basic supply and demand and environment and economic stability. I'm actually quite appalled by what's happened on that front. It was always clear to me that the transition has to be funded, so to speak, by a interim period of nat gas consumption, where nat gas becomes increasingly the dominant fuel, because that base load, only a fossil fuel can really sustain the base load requirements that our system needs. Renewables the technology just isn't there. In fact, the other day I was listening, I don't know which minister it was, or some sort of industry lobbyist, whatever, speaking on the radio, and when pushed on these exact points, the only thing that she could come back with was, well, hopefully in a few years we'll have the technology. I was like, well, that's just, you can't. It's like jumping out of an airplane and knitting your parachute on the way down. That is not a way to manage these things. And if we are going to be humanitarian about it, what is worse, a nuclear crisis or a nuclear war or climate change? I mean, both of them are existential risks, right? So you've got to kind of like balance out. I guess you have to grade your different existential risks, and at least, I'm a bit more concerned about nuclear war than I am about environmental sort of climate change. Not to say I'm not concerned about climate change. I am very much. I'm very concerned about pollution as well. But I think you have to be realistic. And the nat gas situation is just an absolute shock horror, because it was always clear that we would have to have this interim period. And I don't know what they were thinking. And in the UK specifically, they cut out all our storage. So that means the big facilities we had for allowing nat gas to be accumulated in the summer to bridge the imbalances over the winter, that was gone. The idea was that we could depend on international LNG markets instead. Well, this is very equivalent to sort of the financial sort of system, the wholesale markets idea of that brought down Northern Rock, right? The idea was that you didn't need to have your own, long-term secure funding. You could just get it from the market if you really needed it, and then the markets just closed up, and there was none there to get, right? So that this is equivalent in the nat gas field. It was just not it was not a very prudent approach. And then on top of that, we have underinvested in nat gas development. We've underinvested in the assets that we have, whether it's the North Sea or shale gas in the US. And I think obviously that was always going to give the countries that don't care about climate change but care more about power and a mechanism by which to gain international leverage, and that's exactly what's happened. And Putin was no doubt, I mean, in my mind it seems obvious that he probably was very happy to see all these environmental movements, or even fund some of these environmental movements, because it was clearly going to work in his favor in the long run, because we would become less resilient to the possibility of removing ourselves from the energy from dependence on Russia. So I don't buy also this idea that this accelerates our move to renewables, because that is the other thing you hear a lot, and frankly I think that's very naive, because, well, if it does, maybe it will happen in the long run. Like I said, necessity is the mother of invention. But what will be the collateral damage in the interim? And I'm very concerned about this winter. I'm even more concerned about the winter afterwards, because, a shortage of energy to heat people's homes leads to actual death as well. So, I'm a bit worried. I do agree with the general perspective, though, that this was us shooting ourselves in the foot. And we haven't even discussed Germany, which was even more to shut down its nuclear power generation this year.
Yeah, the nuclear threat is what I wanted to pull on. It seems like we do have a solution. I mean, the solution is you need time now to wind it back up. But, the big question to me is, to your point of nuclear war, what are your, or environment, what do you choose? Well, how about nuclear power as a solution to nuclear war, right? It seems like, particularly in Germany, obviously France gets the majority of its power from nuclear. But it's always fascinating to me that in Europe, it doesn't have the natural resources. There's such an unwillingness to make that investment in nuclear power and the move away from it, given it's twice as cost effective than even carbon-based resources. So I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on nuclear, and if you think there's going to be a nuclear renaissance, given it seems to be the one kind of breaker that other than coming up with new technologies or faster ways of doing it. And if we're talking about going to Mars, I think we can control the potential fears and fallout of nuclear reactors. And
if we can control, exactly. Like if we can control a virus with lockdown, which we can't, obviously, that's been proven. It's very unlikely that we can constrain climate change immediately with a policy of cold turkey fossil fuel kind of elimination. It's the same mentality of this sort of incredibly blunt mechanism to deal with an imminent crisis, but not at all thought through in the longer run. We need more subtle measures, ones that create incentives, not just carrots as well as sticks, so to speak. On nuclear, there is a lot of innovation. Because nuclear was so unpopular for so long because of Chernobyl, because of Fukushima, etc., and the one in America, 3 Mile, I think it was 3 Mile, yeah.
3 Mile Island. Yeah, island.
There hasn't been that much innovation in that space, but now finally we've got a lot of innovation. There's a lot of interesting and encouraging technology in the sort of micro nuclear generation field, or in the battery kind of model, where you don't necessarily have to have a reactor that operates in the classical sense. So there is no risk of meltdown, because these new power generation mechanisms effectively charge down. They don't create the same. Well, I'm not in any shape or form a nuclear physicist, but from what I understand, the risk of nuclear meltdown is just not there. So these are all really interesting technologies which were sidelined for unknown reasons. I think it's absolutely crazy that we haven't been looking at these in a more sensible way, and it seems again to be mostly ideological, because it's so connected to sort of the anti-war and anti-nuclear proliferation movement in general, and there is this concern that nuclear is a very elitist, not elitist, but it's like a Western, non-developing country friendly technology, because we would never trust developing countries to have nuclear plants or whatever. But I think that is we have to find ways around those problems, and certainly there is enough potential now to generate different sort of designs in nuclear power plants to merit further investigation. And certainly those countries that don't have consistent sunshine or wind, it makes a lot of sense to look at nuclear for those countries.
Maybe that's the blind spot.
Yeah, no, I definitely, I'm very much pro-nuclear, but like the conventional plants, unfortunately, take like up to 10 years to make. So that's a long time, to get all the permits. I mean, there can be a little bit of acceleration in terms of the bureaucracy of it, but in, just basic development and not in my backyard mentality has to be overcome for these plants to be built in the first place as well.
It's just it's a really interesting topic, and actually Jem and I are going to dive into natural resources and energy in a full episode coming up very shortly as well. And I think it's going to be a topic we're going to be talking about for a very long time. As a Dane, although I live in Switzerland, as a Dane growing up in Denmark as a kid, I always found it very interesting that the Danish anti-nuclear movement was very, very strong. Yet we ended up having a nuclear plant 15 miles from the capital of Copenhagen, but because it was in Sweden. So, I mean, completely crazy policies. And of course, you're right. It takes about 10 years to build these plants. And of course, we would expect our policymakers to be ahead of time thinking about what we were going to be needing in 10 years' time. And now we find ourselves in this crazy situation. I have two small questions left so that we don't take up all of your time this afternoon, Izzy. You said earlier on that you were fearing the winter coming and maybe the next winter coming. And I was just sort of curious, are you a little bit of a prepper? Because that seems to be becoming a term now, mainly in the US, but I think even in Europe now. I heard a Danish podcast this morning about prepping, and I thought, wow, I've never come across that.
I laugh. I am, I guess. I'm definitely the sort of person who plans for all eventualities. So I like to, when I go anywhere, I like to figure out an escape plan, and I always like to hedge myself with respect to kind of, if I can't, if this doesn't go this way, then maybe I have a contingency here and there.
Right.
So I'm big into contingencies. I'm not necessarily convinced that I'll have to use them, but I am a prepper in the sense of, wanting to have those things just in case. I don't, but at the same time, I have to say that my rational head, that's very much my irrational kind of animalistic, panic, fear, but my rational head always concludes that in an actual crisis, all that prepping is likely to be useless, unless it happens on a social level, because in a real crisis, what really gets you through it is the networks that you have and the access to the next networks and your standing within those networks, right? So if you have a good reputation, if people can trust you, if you know 4 or 5 doctors, a few people who can make, you need to know the right people with the right skills. It's the network that's going to help you, not your own individual kind of Scrooge McDucky sort of attitude, because there's just no way, no matter how well prepped you are, you're going to last maximum a month, right? 2 months by yourself. So if you want to look beyond the crisis, you have to look towards the networks that you're going to build. And I think the billionaires, when you read about all these billionaires prepping and buying land in New Zealand or whatever, just in case the worst comes, they've realized that in that crisis situation that their billions are meaningless. They can have the best sort of underground base or whatever, but if there's no network, if there's no, how are you going to pay your little army that's going to protect you and your wealth? At the end of the day, it all goes a bit Mad Max. So you need to have more of a social community-based approach to these things. And I would call it more like a fire drill. You need to have a plan for how, if governments were really smart, they would be helping us establish these networks, very much like the programming we saw, during the Cold War. And, that was in the first instance, people focused on surviving the nuclear attack, but then also kind of how you would operate in a severely impacted environment, right? So I think that's the sort of stuff we should be learning at school. I think that would be really, really good, sort of worthwhile practical survival skills, but how you interact and form, And in a way, I think kids are maybe learning this, but not through school, but through video games. That's my thesis.
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Actually, I thought in the UK you had something called prep school.
No,
that's not
not
the same,
quite.
I imagine. Okay, fair enough. Now, we're going to end this now, but just before you leave, there were so many things we could have asked you, and we haven't even gotten through probably half our questions. So I just want to ask you whether there was something we missed that you really wanted to have brought up, and to give you a chance to bring it up before we close out.
I think we've covered everything. I mean, obviously, the big topic du jour is Elon Musk taking over Twitter. That
Exactly, yeah, that could be one we missed.
I mean,
we didn't miss it.
It's
We didn't get
fascinating to watch, and I just find it very interesting that it's such a polarizing topic. And my own perspective is that I don't think I'm not a free speech absolutist at all. I'm actually what I would call a free speech maximizer, which means I think there are fair enough limits. I think we should have like libel, and I think, you know, incitement to violence and really bad stuff like that should not be allowed. But I wonder whether the system will be able to kind of... I suspect that Elon, once he takes over, if he takes over Twitter, he will learn the hard way that some of these systems are thrust upon you, not because I don't think, you know, Jack Dorsey or whoever, you know, had any intention of creating a censorious environment on Twitter. I think these are sort of natural forces that are thrust upon social systems. Just feeding back to my original point about segmentation, it's because the market can't handle the truth very often, and it'll be interesting to see if you know, if Elon Musk can actually change any of that. I'm curious. I will be watching with a lot of curiosity.
I think there are many people that will be watching with a lot of curiosity. Izzy, this has been a tremendous conversation with so much knowledge shared from your experience. Thank you so much for doing this today. And by the way, make sure to follow and subscribe to Izzy's work over at The Blind Spot. You can, of course, find the links in the show notes for today's episode. And as you can tell from today's conversation, we're living in a true global macro-driven world, and it is perhaps more important than ever before to stay well-informed. From Cem and me, thanks so much for listening, and we look forward to being back with you on the next episode of the Global Macro Series. In the meantime, take care of yourself and take care of each other.
Thanks for listening to Top Traders Unplugged. If you feel you learned something of value from today's episode, the best way to stay updated is to go on over to iTunes and subscribe to the show so that you'll be sure to get all the new episodes as they're released. We have some amazing guests lined up for you, and to ensure our show continues to grow, please leave us an honest rating and review in iTunes. It only takes a minute, and it's the best way to show us you love the podcast. We'll see you next time on Top Traders Unplugged.